Thank you so much. And I welcome all of you in the third panel of the MCC Budapest Summit 2022. In this panel, we are going to explore the very timely and exciting questions and challenge of teaching rights and responsibilities. Please let me first introduce you, our distinguished panelists. We have the huge privilege and pleasure of welcoming the Justice Minister of Hungary, Judit Varga, in the MCC in this panel. She has extensive knowledge and experience in the law of the European Union. She had been working for the European Parliament for a decade and as a Minister of State for EU relations at the Prime Minister's office for 2 years. She is committed to the better education of our future generation of lawyers, and she is particularly concerned about the well-being and nurture of our children. Justice Minister, I thank you so much for honoring our event by joining us. We welcome Bonnie Snyder. She is the author of Undoctrinate, How Politicized Classrooms Harm Kids and Ruin Our Schools, and What We Can Do About It. She is a former teacher, counselor, and professor. She is now working as the Director of High School Outreach at FIRE, Foundation of Individual Rights in Education in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, United States. We welcome Anne Coffinier. She is a diplomat, education expert, alumna of the École Nationale d'Administration, founder of the Création École, Adjuk France, and chairman of the Kairos Foundation. She chose to devote her career to saving France's constitutional right to free education. We have also the honor to welcome here Aaron Rhodes, human rights advocate, thinker, and writer. He is the author of the superb book, The Debasement of Human Rights. And last but definitely not least, we welcome Paul Coleman, who serves as the executive director of the international legal advocacy group ADF from its headquarters in Vienna, Austria. He's an expert in international human rights law, and he has been involved in dozens of cases before the European Court of Human Rights. And we are going to jump right into our crucially important and timely discussion, teaching rights and responsibilities. And let me begin with a very insightful observation of the late Lord Jonathan Sacks, who pointed out that every age has its dominant mode of discourse. In the medieval period, sometimes known as the Age of Faith, the dominant mode of discourse was theological. In the Enlightenment period, sometimes known as the Age of Science, the dominant mode of discourse was scientific. Today, the dominant mode of discourse is the discourse of rights and is the discourse of human rights. However, rights presupposes the existence of responsibilities. Let me quote here the Hungarian Constitutional Court. The man's image in the fundamental law is not that of an isolated individual, but of a responsible personality living in the society. And my very first question is, how do you see the relation between rights and responsibility? And what roles do families, local communities, and national community play in realizing human rights? And I first want to give the floor to Justice Minister.
Thank you very much, dear Minister, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear co-panelists. It is my great honor to be here in the MCC Summit. This is my first time, actually. I just jumped to be with you here, coming from a press conference, because this is an emblematic day for Hungary and for the Hungarian education and the children protection, because the European Court of Justice just delivered a political judgment where the problem is the Hungarian Child Protection Act, enacted by the Hungarian legislature back in June. And the only thing what the Hungarian legislature did last June was just to guarantee the right of the parents to determine the education of their children in line with the religious, philosophical, and pedagogical convictions. Also in line with the Charter of the Fundamental Rights of the European Union, and also this Charter provides also in line with national laws. So two things is clear, that it is in harmony with European values, what the Hungarian legislature did. And the second message is that this belongs to national competence, how we determine the education of our children, which is only in the hands of the Hungarian parents. But coming back to your more complex question, let me also come back or invite you all to go back into history, exactly 800 years ago, 1222, when the Hungarian Magna Carta, which is called the Golden Deed, Aranybulla, was enacted in Székesfehérvár. And when we are talking about human rights, we can never neglect historic and national context. So here comes the historic context. We are living in the 13th century Hungary. There is a different society, different order of the society. But the very basis of rule of law started by defining how to protect the individual and the individual rights against any possibility of arbitrariness of the power. It was the jus resistendi, actually, which was first declared in this deed 800 years ago. So when we are talking about today, we should never neglect this historic context. And then when all the human rights throughout the centuries, especially in the high time when the revolutions were, the French Revolution, we had all over Europe. These freedom fights were actually there to provide and guarantee the protection of the individual against power. But these freedom fights were always attached to the very certain special national, cultural, and societal texture in which these freedom fights were fought. So this is very important when we are dealing with human rights, not to deal with them in an isolated laboratory, but to put them into this context. And from a Hungarian perspective, and this will be my last remark or answer element to your first question, is that responsibilities are as important as rights. And the new Hungarian constitution, which was highly attacked by Brussels already that time, it was actually 10 years ago when it entered into effect, put a special emphasis on this very balance, rights and responsibilities, rights and obligations. For example, the right to the freedom of speech is under chapter rights and responsibilities. So we always have to take care when we are dealing with our own individual rights that we are living in a society, we are members of a community. And for that community, we always have responsibility. So we are not isolated individuals. And here is also very important defining this balance between individual and individual rights and that of rights of the society or the interest of the society. That when we are in Western Europe, maybe it's more individual, and when we are going more to the east, then the rights and the needs and the interests of the society as a whole, or the communities, local communities, are rather prevailing. And during a pandemic, when everywhere in Europe some special legal orders entered into practice, we saw some kind of shift in this balance, and it was well justified because we all of us, we had this kind of constraints. We could not go out whenever we wanted. We had to wear masks. But it was for the sake of the society, for the sake of the common good, for the sake of our common health. So here the balance between community and individual were shifted for a justified reason. So these are my thoughts concerning your first question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for highlighting this abstract question with very concrete examples and bring it closer to us. And I turn to Mr. Coleman. In your practice, how do you see, in your human rights, international human rights practice, how do you see this dilemma between rights and responsibilities? And can we separate rights and the local community? What's your take on it?
I'll also go back in time, but not 800 years, just 60 or so, to say if we are truly living in an age where our discourse, our unifying story is one of rights, what a very shaky foundation that is. And I don't think it was ever intended to become a unifying story in the same way that a religion is. Of course, that's the way it's gone. But the human rights as we know them today came about immediately following the atrocities of the Second World War, which itself was built on the First. So we had total war in Europe for several decades. And it's out of that context that the modern-day human rights documents were formed. And they were formed, I think, with a relatively limited goal in mind, which was to stop the abuse of arbitrary power that led to the concentration camps, that led to the total destruction that we saw across the continent, and of course around the world as well. The challenge is seeing rights simply as we're going to list a limited number of things that the state can't do to me or take away from me, these negative rights. The other negotiating power during that time was the Soviet Union and all of the Soviet states that voted as a bloc. And they saw rights as actually being things, listing things that the state will do for you. Listing all of these things that the state will actually provide for you and do for you and give to you. And it's that component of rights that has allowed, over the course of the last 60 years, this never-ending list of things that people require from the state, that things are, should be given to them from the state. And that puts the state, or in many ways the superstate, the EU and the UN, in this position of rights giver. And they give, and they can also, therefore, take away. And this is an extremely fragile and shaky foundation to create as a modern discourse. And it is unsustainable. It cannot be sustained. And so I think that as it relates to the local level, as it relates to this question of responsibilities, I think we also ought to be cautious and wary of vesting power in these superstructures and having these superstructures that give us these rights also tell us what our responsibilities are, because they tell us what they are in line with their own view of the world. And to come back to the Hungary law situation, it was last year that Ursula von der Leyen said that this law was, quote, a shame. And she said it goes against EU values. Well, do we want her to be telling us what they are? And do we want her to be telling us what our responsibilities to her and to the state are? So they're obviously related, but I think we have to be very cautious about vesting that amount of power in these superstructures and then saying that they can tell us what our responsibilities are.
And how, let's take a more educational approach. And I'm curious, what Bonnie Snyder, how do you approach the connection of rights and responsibilities and local community, and how local community, what role local community plays in teaching rights and responsibilities to different multi-level, to different levels of the education system in your practice?
Yes, well, in America, we have a Bill of Rights. We don't have a Bill of Responsibilities. And I think that, generally speaking, we have the responsibility to respect the rights of others. And another one of our rights or of our responsibilities is to be self-reliant. If anyone has ever read Emerson's great essay on self-reliance, that's a very, I think, American statement of our view of the responsibilities of an American citizen. And as it relates to schools, our schools are locally governed, which should work to the advantage of preventing any terrible ideology from metastasizing throughout the entire country. However, wokeness seems to be defying some of the checks and balances that we have in place. But you will find places in America where some of the current concerning ideologies are not present, and that's because our schools are run by local school boards, and parents who are concerned about what is going on in their local school have the right to show up according to public fora rules and to express themselves and to use their freedom of speech. I would, FIRE, where I work, is for the most part a free speech organization, and we defend your constitutional right to say what you believe to be true. And part of that involves letting other people speak as well. And that is a problem that we are seeing, is people trying to silence other people, which is a very new occurrence in the United States of America and is causing a great deal of concern. In terms of culturally teaching about rights, it certainly is part of the prescribed curriculum probably in every school district in America, but we need to do better, clearly, because the evidence shows that we are not transmitting this information as well as we should.
Thank you so much for sharing this American experience. And if we come to the old continent, from this educational perspective, what can we see? What's your experience in France and in Western Europe?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. I just want to pay a tribute to Roger Scruton, because I have the huge privilege to be one of his friends. Maybe it's too much knowledge, and I have in the past organized incredible debates in Edinburgh about what could be a cultural policy with him. So I was very touched to see his name all around here, Café Scruton and so on, so that's a great pleasure. First of all, I mean that rights are individual rights, where responsibilities are more social or more collective. And nowadays, in France and probably all around Europe also, we have a problem with collective, with expression of collectiveness. And we have a thinker, which name is Manon, which said that we have a really big problem. This big problem is that we know how to create new rights, but we don't know how to associate, to manage these, and to build a society. We have a sort of dissociation process rather than a construction process of a common good. And if we go back to the question of education, that probably is the main challenge that we have to face, to create conditions to build a common good. And what I see is that pupils learn their rights, their individual rights, but nobody teaches them their responsibilities. And maybe the first thing, rather than teaching education for moral and civic education, probably the first thing to teach them is history. And I believe that is probably the best way of giving them the sense of community and the sense of their responsibility. And one of the more powerful words to me on this question is empowerment. You can't live, you can have the question of responsibilities and rights as something that you have to claim to the state or to claim to the society. That's not a good way of taking this question. For me, what is important is to give the children this idea that they have to empower. They have to take that on themselves and to live it. And if they have in this position of claiming, of asking for society, for state, for European Union, no what, that's not a sort of position that will help them to live freely.
Thank you so much for this insight. And last but not least, Aaron, what's your view on the relation between rights and responsibilities? Maybe you can highlight the different approach between Western countries like North America or United States, Western European countries, and probably Central European countries from your point of view and from your experience.
Oh, thank you. Well, in my work as a human rights activist, I'm a worker in human rights, basically. I've been traveling and pleading with authoritarian states to get people out of jail who have been put there because of their beliefs, and give people the ability to communicate and to associate with one another as they wish. But very often I've heard, actually, from such officials in such countries, well, they talk about, oh, they're tired of hearing about human rights. They want to think about the citizens' responsibility. And so that they talk about these things as if somehow there's some kind of contradiction between responsibilities and rights, and they're tired of hearing about human rights, and they want the citizens to shut up and just do what they're told, and we will tell you how to live, and be subservient, and just be grateful for what you've got. This is the attitude. The fact is that these ideas are not in contradiction whatsoever, and if you go into the formation of the idea of human rights, which has entered into the human rights system that we have today, one of the main thinkers, of course, was Immanuel Kant. And Kant noted that we have a duty, we have a response. He talked about duty, which is close to the idea of responsibility. I looked it up in the thesaurus, and they say that they're more or less the same meaning. But we have a duty to respect human rights. We have a duty to respect the rights of the other person. And the reason is that that as individuals we have freedom, and we have moral agency, and we have reason. And therefore, impinging on another person's freedom is wrong. And we have a responsibility to treat other people with respect for that reason. But now I want to talk about, just to conclude, I do think there is developing a contradiction between the notion of rights and responsibilities, and the reason is the proliferation of human rights, which Paul mentioned. More and more people see human rights as something they get, something to which they are entitled, material things to which they are entitled from the state. Whereas the more authentic approach to human rights should be guarantees of individual freedom and the treatment of equal respect and concern from the state. But with this proliferation of human rights comes forms of irresponsibility, where people expect the state to do things that they should do, that their families, their communities should do. And there this is a difficulty, I think, in the way human rights has developed. And I do believe that we should try to pare down the concept of human rights and focus on a few fundamental freedoms, and talk about, we can still promote standards for welfare, that give basic security to needy individuals in society. But when we start calling all these things human rights, and when we start identifying different collective rights, you know, there's a UN treaty that's being formed, the rights of the elderly. What are the rights of the elderly? Aside from human rights, all elderly. I'm 73 years old, by the way, and I don't think I have any special rights because I'm so old. But this is going, and then, you know, who's driving this treaty on rights for the elderly? I will tell you, it's the lobby for old people's homes. They want these standards locked into law and taken out of the democratic realm and made into a law. And of course, human rights are very seductive this way, because, you know, you take your specific issue and you remove it from politics and you make it a law, and then you got it.
Thank you so much for highlighting the harmony, the need to harmony between rights and responsibilities, and you also touched upon a very timely and interesting questions. There's the proliferation of rights and human rights claims. So it seems that whatever people want to achieve today, they do it in the language of rights. They use it as a lingua franca, so-called lingua franca, in order to justify their position on cultural norms, policies, and on the common goods. So what we face is a burgeoning claims of rights today. We can also call it an inflation of rights, or you call it in your book debasement of human rights. And my next big question relates to this phenomenon. Are you such false claims of rights? And if so, how can you distinguish between valid and invalid human rights or claims of rights in your view? And we can proceed, I think, this way.
Yeah, and before I answer that, you know, we tend to think of our rights not as coming from government, but from God in America. That's how the Constitution was written, so we will refer to our God-given rights. And the unjustifiable claim of rights that I hear most often is the right not to be offended. And yeah, I heard people laugh, and I also find it laughable, so I will leave it at that.
Yeah, well, what you're identifying is completely true. That I read an essay once on the proliferation of human rights that said the human rights system now has all the accessibility of a tax code, and that is what we're seeing. It's so complex. There's so much machinery. No one can possibly understand it, and within that complexity comes this invention of new rights, or we call them at ADF faux rights, F-A-U-X, just fake, basically. And I remember I was at the Human Rights Council a few years ago, and they were negotiating a resolution on the rights of the family. And it was being chaired by an African delegate. He had drafted the text, but not referenced where he was drawing the language from, which would normally happen. So you would see, okay, this is already agreed language. And he put forward a clean text, so people would have to do the work themselves to know where this language was being drawn from. I was in the room when a whole host of Western diplomats took the floor and looked at this resolution, and they could not agree with some of the language in it. It said, my government cannot adopt this language, that the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society. No, we cannot agree with this, or that parents have a prior right to choose the education for their children. My government cannot accept this language. And the African diplomat then pointed out that this language was drawn from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. which was obviously embarrassing for the Western diplomats, one of whom was from my country in the UK. But it goes to show just this total distortion that's taking place within the human rights machinery that exists. And the reason I bring this example up is it not only shows this distortion, but actually in how we can distinguish, how we can determine, to answer that question, the Universal Declaration and then the treaties that followed, in particular the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights or the European Convention on Human Rights, the language contained within these documents is actually pretty good. And it's my belief that it is a lot better than we would get if we were trying to do it today. And so we see within it the protection of the right to life. It defines the right to marriage as between a man and a woman. It protects the right to freedom of religion, to free speech, association, and so forth. So the issue is not so much that we don't know what these are, we don't know where to find them. It's more the consistent misinterpretation of these clauses over time where we see the challenge. And that's where we need to be engaging. And unfortunately, many conservatives, once these treaties were adopted, they just abandoned the space completely. And that is the case today. So if you go to these settings, you won't find a divergent range of views. You will find one uniform view, and it's extremely leftist interpretation. It has been for years. And so we won't get anywhere within this human rights framework if we don't find a way to re-engage the system and put forward an authentic understanding of human rights.
Thank you very much. I always enjoy sitting in a panel of specialists, experts, so I actually don't need my notes because I just have so much food for thought from your interventions. I'm just a simple, humble Hungarian woman from the countryside, so I wouldn't make this too complex. I'm a Hungarian politician on top of it, so I don't want to make things more complicated from an expert point of view, because I think common sense, reality, evident things are here crucial to be able to see the forest behind the tree. Because this proliferation, I really liked your phrase, and also what you said, the lobby, for example, for some rights, is key here to understand what's happening. Because when we come back to the origins, human rights were there to protect the individual, so the state, so the power had to be in a negative position, not to interfere. Then they evolved over time, rightly, because there was an active requirement to do something so that the individuals are protected. That's still okay, but then in the 21st century, end of 20th century, everything became too complicated. And I can't help to share my views from a European law and European values perspective, because I'm fighting our rule of law debates on behalf of the Hungarian government. And what my conclusion is always, after so long discussions and hours of debates in the Council and also with our critiques, that unfortunately, today, values, tastes, preferences are mixed up with legal terms and phrases. There is a very stable treaty framework, what we joined. This is a club, and we accepted the rules of the club. And we try to carry out our activities in the framework of these legal provisions, what the treaty gave us, what we accepted. But what we realized that in operation, this whole community, just because they have, for certain cases, for certain lobbies, they have political majority, they use the legal tools not as a constraint to political activity, but as a tool for realizing political will. Mm-hmm. And this is how rule of law became actually an abuse of law. In our experience, unfortunately, because just because some dominant political majority thinks that, for example, mass migration is good for the continent, and some minority in the political landscape does not think that it is a good thing for the continent. This is a question of positions, historic experiences, political position. But in any case, it is not a legal question. So those who are wanting to stop illegal migration, they are not illegally doing this. They are doing it in the legal framework because they have all right to act and to react to a challenge like this. And while those who think that migration is a positive thing, they think that just because their preferences pro-migration or pro-anything as big questions of our societies today, they think that they are the right one, they are who have a rule of law in their societies, and those who have a different position on this not legal question, I'm repeating myself, but this position, then they are somewhere in the illegal territory. And here comes that values are there to be protected by the law. But the values are rooted in societies and cultural backgrounds and histories. So this is, there should be always, in this chaos of proliferation of rights, always a check whether we are still in line with the needs of the society, whether our rights are there to protect the values of the society, or they are only there to advocate and to lobby and to pressure for certain dominant positions. So here we have to make it very clearly, we have to make a very clear distinction between rights, legal obligations, preferences, and values, and put this into also society context. Are we talking about Central European societies? Do we live in North America? So it's all different how our societies have their preferences and then position on the values. So this is the real problem of the rule of law debates today, that it is a pressuring tool, not a real legal tool. Thank you.
And the stakes are enormous because there is a saying that he who calls the piper, he who pays the piper calls the tune. So at the end of this process, the stakes are enormous. So thank you very much for highlighting this side of this question. And I give the floor to Aaron.
Well, Madam Minister, you said you were just a simple Hungarian woman, but you confused me with your intellectual speech, I have to say. I don't think I can quite absorb it, but just to answer very simply the question about making a distinction between valid claims and invalid claims to human rights. And I think the simplest way to do this is to say, is it universalizable? Is it universalizable? And the beauty of civil and political rights, of negative liberties, is that, yes, any ruler, any state can say, I'm not censoring, I'm not restricting your freedom of information. It doesn't require money. It doesn't require bureaucracy. It doesn't require anything but a decree or a law. It can be done. Whereas welfare rights are difficult. Well, it takes money to provide welfare rights. It takes bureaucracy. It takes laws. It takes consensus. It takes all these things. And so there's inequality. All the states in the world could have could equally give freedom of expression, but of course they don't. Secondly, I wanted to just give, for your possible interest, a terrible example of the proliferation of rights, the right to abortion, the human right to abortion. Imagine this. Well, where did it come from? Where did this idea come from? It came from a lobby which engaged a UN committee of the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. The oversight treaty body was convinced by a bunch of radical feminists in America to interpret the treaty in a way which creates a human right to abortion. It's a complete fiction, and it's a source of conflict in the international human rights, by the way. And just a last point is, getting to this mess that we have in human rights today, the proliferation of human rights and the invasion of human rights by ideologues, mainly of the left, because, quite frankly, the left has made a hash of human rights. This occurred after the end of the Cold War. And during the Cold War, both states and civil society understood human rights to refer to liberties. And it was quite clear that the communist bloc was completely hypocritical in the use of economic and social rights as a human right. And these rights had a bad reputation, rightfully, during this conflict between the free world and the communist world. But after that ended, the idea of economic and social rights suddenly had this burden of Soviet totalitarianism lifted off of it, first of all. And second of all, a lot of the activists who were involved in human rights during the Soviet period, well, what were they going to do now? They needed a job. And so they came into human rights promoting various left-wing ideas. And the result of this was this 1993 Vienna meeting on international human rights, where a lot of the nonsense that we find in human rights treaties and advocacy and soft law came into the system.
I will try also to answer the question how to distinguish valid or false claims of human rights. And the first thing we need is to solve previously the question to know what is good and what is right. And in very multicultural societies, it seems to be a lost war. And more than multiculturalism, we also have to face nihilism, relativism. So if we come from these backgrounds where there is no God, where there is no good, where there is no bad, where you can't judge. If you judge, you are in judgism. If you think you discriminate concepts and you have not to discriminate because you should have, or you have the risk to have a discriminatory thinking. In fact, you have a problem. You can't have the condition necessary to work out the question of valid or invalid human rights. On top of that, nowadays everything is new, is supposed to be better than everything is inherited. So the impression that I have is that a new right could be good when it doesn't destroy a well-established human right. It could be a way of solving the question.
Thank you so much for all of you for the insights. And we turn to the last big question, last round of big question. We are speaking about teaching of rights and responsibilities. So we cannot avoid the question of civics and constitutional education, which have a long-standing traditions in many Western and non-Western countries. For example, in the United States, the National Constitution Center and the Federalist Society are deeply committed to educate on different levels, on all people, about the constitutional traditions and the rights and responsibilities of citizens. Here, this is also part of the mission of the MCC, and this is also what we are aspire to do here in this conference. How do you see the importance of civics and constitutional education in our society? How can they increase awareness and understanding of a nation's values, virtues, and rights and responsibilities of their citizens. And do we have a responsibility to pursue this? And what's the danger of if we neglect it?
What's happening in the United States, I do go to conferences throughout the United States which represent different disciplines, such as in America, history has now morphed into what's known as social studies, which is a whole other discussion. And there are always organizations like the National Constitution Center and others there actively promoting the proper teaching, I think, of constitutional values. A problem, though, is that civics has morphed in the United States into what they're calling civic engagement and action civics or active civics, where students, instead of reading books and reading the philosophy behind the founding that undergirds our Constitution, they are maybe marching in the streets or attending a rally or doing activism. And so this has been a debasement, I guess you could say, of civics. And I would say as well that when it comes to rights and responsibilities, I tend to think that parents have rights and students have rights and teachers have responsibilities. Teachers have the responsibility to adhere to the ethical guidelines that govern the practice of teaching in the United States and in different states. There are many of these, and they're very well written, and if we would just live up to them, everything would be fine. So we need to remind teachers of their responsibilities. Do teachers have rights? I would say yes, they have the right to collect a paycheck for doing their job that they were hired to do.
Thank you for this insight, and let's move on.
Okay. Well, I'll connect a little bit to what some of the things that were said in the previous panel. Rod Dreher talked about the atomization of society, what's happening right now. And I think we have to recognize that part of the human rights or the rights discourse, it's helped fueling that to a degree. What I mean is, if you think of normal society and work upwards, so you have, for example, the individuals, then they're in a family, and then they have mediating institutions like churches or other community groups, then perhaps local politics, national politics, and then finally you have some of these superstructures, the EU or the UN. And rights as a dominant discourse sort of leapfrogs everything in between. And so you have these individuals, leapfrog, 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 and then you get to the rights givers, the UN, the EU, and this is very dangerous if we're then saying that these are the institutions that are going to teach us values and virtues, because they are so far removed from the different and unique individual contexts of people, and I think it's extremely dangerous. So I would answer the question by saying yes to civics, yes to constitutional education, but who's doing it? And what are they teaching? And I don't want this to be vested in these superstructures outside of the family, outside of the local community. Yesterday, I wrote it down. I mean, I've been following the situation in Canada extremely closely, as I'm sure many in this room have, and also, honestly, horrified, absolutely horrified by what I've been seeing from Trudeau and the government. I think it's outrageous. Yesterday, he said, and I quote, "We'll do whatever is necessary to reinforce the principles, values, and institutions that keep all Canadians free. And that's why we are enacting the Emergencies Act." Now, Trudeau's wants to reinforce values by taking your money, by threatening you with prison and doing all the other things that come under this tyrannical piece of legislation. And I don't want that power to be vested in people like him. And that is the same, and I mentioned the Ursula von der Leyen example, who, in criticizing Hungary, talked about this vague notion of EU values, which again, it's whatever she wants it to be. And in my UK context, the British government decided to introduce something called British values in 2014, and it was a complete disaster because they couldn't agree on what any of these things were. And so I think we have to be looking at this educational side of things from looking at this hierarchy, starts in the family, then in the community, in these mediating institutions, then at the local level, national, and then, if at all, at this superstructure level.
So it can only work in a bottom-up way.
Bottom up, yeah. But what we've done is we've leapfrogged everything. We've
Yes.
seeded everything in between. And now we just have this extremely aggressive top-down that I think for a long time people didn't mind because they didn't see, well, it doesn't affect me, it doesn't matter to me. And now as it's unsustainable, and now as we're seeing the pressure points come, we're seeing this raw abuse of power in this top-down way.
Sorry for repeating myself, but common sense, soberness, reality is key. And coming back to your idea of bottom-up, I would say that, yes, let's turn it all around, and let's start by reality. When we are teaching our children, when we are talking to our children, they have to really see what their actions, what kind of consequences their actions, their everyday activities have on their own and on our lives, and also what kind of effect on the society. And if we look at from a rights perspective, they also have to learn how to make, they have to evolve the ability to make distinctions between what is good, what is right. And I think to decide what is good, what is right, does not start by the text of the law, but starts by the reality. Because we all feel in real situation what is good, what is right. And the old Roman law said, the law is a moral minimum. So actually, in a very beautiful world, we wouldn't even need any law, because everybody knew what is right, what is wrong. So I would just, tell to our children to be real, to be fair, to have high moral standards, and then translate this into law. Because if we isolate individual rights and we only advocate for them, we fetishize them, then on the long run they will not work. Because if something is only good for the isolated individual, but not good for the society as a whole, then it won't be benefiting anybody on the long run. So this is the constant connection to the reality, to the real world is important. And that's why I think the state has a responsibility to guarantee this freedom of choices and put the choice, for example, when it comes to the education of children, into the hands of the families, because we base our societies on the strength of our families. This is how our nation is building up. And we have to guarantee that the own individual path of growing up is without any kind of external interference, unwanted interference, what families would not like to have on their children. But this is providing freedom for families. It is not obliging anyone to do anything. And there is a very important saying, help yourself so God will also help you. So here, coming back again, not just to approach from our rights perspective, but always ask ourselves and also teach this to our children, what can I do so that not only my position but everyone else's position will be improved. So reality, soberness, common sense, less paper, more action. This is my message.
Thank you so much for this insight.
We're talking about children and human rights and civic education, and I don't think children are really in a position to absorb information about UN treaties and maybe even about national constitutional law. And unfortunately, though, human rights education has become a very technocratic realm, and it's it's just these are the laws. So you go to a human rights course, or which I never have, by the way. But if you study human rights in a university, in a prestigious university, they're going to start off with, well, there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the beginning, which is not the beginning of human rights. So what human rights is suffering from is suffocating methodological positivism right now. The fact is that when we speak about civic education, I'm not even sure this is the way to get to human rights, because human rights is about the realm we live in where the law can't reach us. It's our freedom. It's our zone of freedom, freedom of moral choice. That in a liberal society, and I mean this in a classical liberal society, this is what the laws protect. I think that if we are speaking about children and teaching about human rights, we should think about moral education. And in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we can find most of the main principles of human rights right there. It's right in the Old Testament. Almost everything you can find in the Old Testament, not in the sense of the legal protection of human rights, because no religious tradition has a tradition of the legal protection of human rights, but they have the foundations which brought us to that point. Just as a couple of examples, you'll find in the Old Testament that we are all ultimately answerable not to any ruler, but to God. That no ruler truly rules over us, that we are accountable to God or to nature. You find that we are made in the image of God, which means that we're free. We're free like God is free, and we have choice. We have the possibility to make mistakes. We have responsibility. We have agency. And we find, especially in the Christian tradition, that each individual personality is sacred. And this is one of the main moral foundations of international human rights. And I think if we teach children this, they're going to be able to absorb the idea of human rights from the bottom up.
You have just taught what I wanted to say. That's not good thing for me. So, coming back to moral and civic education, for once I will disagree with Thomas Aquinas, because Thomas Aquinas say love follow knowledge, and for moral and civic education, I don't think so. I think that's love for responsibilities and rights, love for what is the very core of civic education, follows practical experience. If you practice virtues, then you get the sense of virtues. And maybe the first thing that we have to give to the children is moral virtues, in letting them the occasion of practicing these virtues, more than receiving discourses about human rights and so on. And for that, for example, the British schools are very good. They give opportunity to the children to have responsibilities in the community, in the school community. And the idea is that if you are a good citizen in the school communities, then later you will become a good citizen for the nation. This sort of preparation to the responsibilities, to the civic responsibilities, doesn't exist in France, for example, where we give no responsibilities at all to the children until 18. So that you can be 3 or 15 and 18, you have no responsibilities at all. And then when you become a citizen, you don't know exactly what you can do with all these responsibilities because you have no experience of it. So the first thing I would like to say is that give opportunity to the children to have real, limited, but real responsibilities. The second thing is that the children learn through examples. So if they have no good examples, they learn nothing. because words are nothing compared to testimony. And they need more good masters, moral masters, than good discourses. For example, if the teacher of pupils are not in a situation of showing courage, implication, involvement, if they have this terrible experience of seeing them being coward, or being in a situation where they say nothing to irrational or illogical or unjust situation, then they learn the habit to be themselves coward. And that's an experience very well developed. So the first thing is to make sure that teachers are strong people, able to stand up when it needs to stand up. The last thing I would like to say is that, but you told it, if we believe in utilitarianism, if we don't think that something more important than just knowing if something works or not, if we totally break all the connection with the idea of that the world is created or the world is a sort of mysterium in which we have to live, if we don't follow the Christ, because the Christ is, for me, the key of real love, true love, then I really don't know how we can have a sort of sense of fraternity, of solidarity with other human beings. For me, it's in renewing with the knowledge of the testimony of the Christ, which is probably the best way of making the human rights more powerful in our life.
Thank you so much for these thoughtful words. And before we turn to the closing arguments, I take a couple of questions from the audience. There are some really good questions. So I will read out two that are seemingly related to each other. If we teach morality in schools, what morality to teach? By doing so, aren't we influencing the children? Isn't it the parents' sole right to teach their children this? And what do you think, at which stage our children should be taught first about human rights and responsibilities of being part of their community, and by whom they should be taught? So these are the first pair of questions, wonderful pair of questions from the audience, and I turn to the panel. Whoever would like to elaborate on first.
I'll have a go.
Yes, please.
Traditionally, parents have been regarded as the people to pass on the values and the morality to the children, and teachers have deferred to their authority. We are seeing that challenged. And we are seeing the parents rightfully rising up and showing their frustration with this in school board meetings. So those are the checks and balances that I think are in place. And I do think they are operating properly. And in terms of, I just want to turn back to the civics question for just a quick moment, that when it comes to examples, I don't think that we have had a better civics lesson than the Canadian truckers. And if there's anyone in America who didn't enjoy that immensely and wasn't rooting for the Canadian truckers, I have not met them.
You mean the terrorists?
There are, as a free speech, there are time, manner, and place restrictions on protests. However, so I will make that mention of that.
So, I think I answered a little bit by whom. I have Rodre in the last session, I wrote it down because it was funny, he said, "You cannot trust the institutions. Schools will deceive parents." Quote. So I think that what we're seeing develop within many countries is a worldview that we would not want to be taking root in primary schools and kindergartens and in all these other places. And so I think that and I said it earlier, but the treaty law and a lot of the human rights framework, the black letter law, is not too bad at all. And one of the things it emphasizes that parents have a prior right to choose the education that should be given to their children. That word prior right, that means it's pre-political. It can't be given, it can't be taken away. And that's a solid foundation to build on, to think that first and foremost, this responsibility rests with the parents. I don't think there's no role for schools. I mean, if you're living in an environment that is so hijacked and so taken over, then you've got much bigger problems. I mean, there's other questions about should the children even be in those schools? And so I think in a situation that is that overrun, it's impossible to answer the question in isolation. And I think there is a role for schools and other educational establishments. But first and foremost, it rests with the parents, and the parents have to have that responsibility, and as part of that responsibility, they have to be responsible for what their children are hearing in schools. And speaking to my friends with young children through the schooling system at the moment, my friends are extremely blasé and casual about what their children are receiving, because they imagine that it's basically the same as when they were in school, and it has changed a lot in a very short period of time. And so parents have the responsibility, yes, to teach, but also to know what's being taught.
But if I may, I think you brought up a very important point, which is deception. And we are facing a crisis of trust between school and home and a lack of transparency. So I would not just argue, but I insist that schools and teachers must be completely transparent and honest and truthful about what's going on in the classrooms. There's no room for anything else.
And I mean, if I pick up on that, so my children attend a school we're very happy with, and they do teach virtue and morals in school. They have their gute Gewohnheit, their good habits, but the parents are part of that. And so we at home, we know what the gute Gewohnheit is, and we are encouraged as parents to instill that at home. And so it's a partnership between the parents and the school. So I wouldn't want to say that we cut schools out, this is only for the home. But it has to be, there can't be this deception, there has to be this partnership, and it has to be transparency between what's in the school and then what the parents are happy with.
Well, I just answered the question from my capacity as a mother of three, because I'm not a teacher. But how to teach morality is basically the question to answer how to teach to make difference between good and bad, in my views. And there is no one-size-fits-all answer ever. I don't think that can exist. But as parents, we have responsibilities to give a map, give a guidance for our children, and to let them walk their own pathway. And there was a recent example. My son came home from the school, and the teacher just announced that there was going to be a test next day. And someone told to my son at school that, oh, but there are the bylaws of the school, that teachers are not allowed to announce, but at least, 48 hours before the time of the test. So it was formally illegal in their views. And, my son told this to me, and he actually started to search for the bylaws on the net. And I said, and here comes the teaching, what to do, because according to my moral, okay, that's it. In my age, when I was at school, okay, that was a test. I just learned and then sat down and I made it. So I wouldn't encourage my child to start by his rights and look at the bylaws, but say, okay, come on, we are in a COVID situation. Everything is, A week, B week, half of the class is sick. So please try to understand the teacher, his or her position. Please try to deliberate. Please try to balance between the elements of this situation and make your choice. But what is good for the class? Is it good that you don't miss a test because you have to keep up with the time schedule, etc.? So I actually convinced him to sit down to learn for the test instead of playing freedom fighters or playing a human rights activist. I'm sorry to be so extreme here, because of course there must be situations where the bylaws are very important. But the first reaction when we are teaching moral should be, in which position am I? Is my damage if I sit down to learn? So this kind of balancing between good and right action, I think in each and every situation is important. What we have to do to give a map, to give principles, to give guidance, to find the right way to do in that very situation. So as a mother, this is my answer.
Well, Leonard, your question reminded me of something because having to do with public education in the United States. And there's a large body of opinion that public education in the United States has deteriorated. And in the 19th century, teachers were better, and people had to learn more than they do in public school today. And they did have moral education in schools. So, as an example, a child learning to read, or write rather, a child learning to write. Okay, they copy different sentences over and over again. And the teacher looks at the writing to see if they have used correct script and so on. But what were they writing is the question. And what they were writing were things like the following. And I just remembered one of these phrases that were used in 19th century writing books. Job felt the rod, but loved his God. It's a lesson, a moral lesson. And today, you couldn't do that. You couldn't introduce something like that in an American public school because people would say that you were trying to impose religion and, et cetera, et cetera. And there's no consensus anymore in most of the developed Western societies about these questions. And I think this is a terrific, this is what we have talked about today throughout this meeting, it seems, and what to do about this. And I certainly don't have the answer, but it certainly lies in the moral fragmentation of Western societies and the diversification of societies where there is no consensus about such things. And we shouldn't glorify the past either, by the way. We shouldn't be too nostalgic. Okay, they said this in the 19th century, but the 19th century in America was no moral paradise, believe me. Just look at the history books, look at the debauchery and the idiocy that, the craziness, the conflict in the society. It was no moral paradise, but at least there was a kind of North Star available to children and families, rooting them in this moral tradition. And I think probably in the future that the answer to these questions, institutionally speaking, means private schools, where parents have a choice to send their children to a school that educates them with the moral foundation that they want.
Maybe just one word regarding private schools. So I work on private school in France, and one of the interests of this type of school is that we try to enhance the sense of life. The first thing that we have to transmit to children is the will of life, the taste of life, the energy of living. And it seems to be something evident, but it isn't. The whole context is very repressive. And you can teach everything you want, but if you don't teach of confidence and the willing of live and to contribute to his time and to the good, to construction of society, and to fighting against, for example, injustice and so on, if you don't give, first of all, this confidence to the children, I have the impression that you give nothing. And maybe we are too much in a sort of formalism of the rights instead of a sort of sense of basic justice. And maybe also, it's a little bit your experience that give me this idea, maybe our children have the experience of seeing us always dealing with formal reality rather than basic justice. And maybe it's time to go back sometimes to also this experience of basic justice. Is it good or not to do this test? Is it good or not to transform yourself in a sort of big inquisitor of your own teacher? Who are you to be in this position? And so on. So maybe go back to this sort of priority, maybe through literature, poetry, and so on, going back to maybe beauty rather than morality, and sense of life rather than big discourses.
Linda, can I just add on one very practical footnote, which didn't come up, and I just thought of it now, in terms of the by whom and within the school context. It's not been mentioned yet, but on a very practical level, parents here ought to be very careful of outside groups coming into school to do a lot of this. This is what we've seen in the UK. It's not actually so much within the school establishment itself. A number of years ago, after I left schools, we never had it. It became an industry where special interest groups would form partnerships with local school authorities and go around into classes teaching activism, basically, to children. And this just became an accepted thing that would happen. Often the teachers would not even be in the room. And so I would say on a very practical level, that is something that people have to be extremely careful of and concerned about. And if you're in an environment where outside groups, often registered charities, are coming into school to teach children about certain special interests, that's where so many of these challenges come from.
If I can second that, consultants, outside consultants, DEI consultants, and we have teachers who are suing for violation of their rights for training they were forced to undergo and the compulsion of their speech to do things like confess their white privilege or things like that as a condition of employment, and those cases are proceeding.
Thank you so much for these valuable insights. And we spared the last 8 to 10 minutes to the closing arguments. Again, we approach from a more philosophical view. There are different approaches and different views, competing views of rights and human rights that we can witness if we can look back to the history or just in our contemporary society. One of the dominant view, especially in Western countries, is that everything which is not forbidden is allowed, which is a position of liberty. However, at the same time, we also see we have a heritage from the teaching of the Bible that says a competing version, which I quote: "So in everything do to others what you would have them do to you." And in light of this philosophical difference, which has of course very grave consequences in concrete cases, and if you apply it in the real world, what, in your view, what role should rights and responsibilities play in our future cultures, societies, and what approach we might nurture to better defend valid and true rights. And I first give the floor for the closing arguments. Well, this way we can proceed. Yeah.
So what you referred to, what we call the golden rule in the United States, do unto others, which clearly comes from the Bible. And watching the procession of this, I call it a new morality, that they're imposing a new morality system on our schools without getting the agreement of the parents and the community. And that's one of the things that I noticed, is that they're actually arguing, no, it's not do unto others as you would have done unto you, it's do unto others as they would have you do to them, which is not the same thing at all. And so I was puzzling over this, and I mentioned it to someone, and he said, oh yeah, that's called the platinum rule. And I said, what? It has a name. It has a name. So this is, caused me to sort of write down all of the, it's not so much even that Christianity has been subtracted from the schools, it has. And then there was sort of a period of just this vacuum, and now this new morality is coming in to fill this vacuum that is clearly anti-Christian, that we need to be alert to, especially, if you consider yourself to be in the Judeo-Christian tradition or whatever tradition, religious tradition, this new ideology has religious components to it. And it's time for all of us to be very clear about what we stand for and to be hyper aware of what they are telling our children, because these may be in direct conflict with your values.
Thank you. So, to close, to go back to what Aaron said about this idea of a North Star. So this is there's an idea that there is some sort of philosophical agreement, there is some unifying view through which we, as a society, view the world and therefore view fundamental questions like, where do rights come from? And the reality is that we do not have that philosophical agreement. And at the time that these human rights documents were drafted, there was not that philosophical agreement on the big questions. They grounded the modern human rights era in the concept of human dignity, but that just punted the question one step further, because then the next question is, well, where does the concept of human dignity come from, which they don't answer. And for example, in the US context, it comes from God. So there's some sort of North Star. But in our human rights context, it only goes back to this idea of dignity and no further. So I think we're left with a question then, okay, how do we proceed? I remember reading about Jacques Maritain, the great Catholic scholar, very much involved in the drafting of the modern human rights framework. And he said, we agree on the rights, provided we are not asked why. He said, with the why, the dispute begins. And so I take a very practical view. If they couldn't agree that why question 60, 70 years ago, then looking at the current state of things, particularly in the West, I do not think we are going to agree that why today either. And therefore, I think we need to view human rights as a baseline, as a minimum standard baseline, and not see it as an overarching discourse about all the different things that I want and that I'm obliged to receive and everything else. And so if we could somehow, again, view human rights along that baseline, there's just a certain and finite list of things that cannot be taken away from me and cannot be done to me, like torture, I think we'll be in a much better position.
Well, thank you very much for the whole discussion. To conclude, I would like to use the words of The Economist. Last year in September, there was a series of articles with the title "How Liberals Became Illiberal," and it was ringing the alarm for themselves among liberals that why they should now really take care of what's going on with their own ideology. And there is a very good sentence to describe this situation, and I would like to give this for you to think about it, to think about your own answers, whether you are conservatives or liberals. The article was titled Echoes of the Confessional State. It's very interesting already. Classical liberals conceded that your freedom to swing your fist stops where my nose begins. Today's progressives argue that your freedom to express your opinions stops where my feelings begin. So it's completely irrealistic and relativized, and we are lost because there are no clear limits to my freedom. There are no clear limits where my responsibility starts, because I have no clue where your feelings start. So this is, I think, the situation today. And interestingly, the classical liberal view, what we all learned at law school, that my freedom stops when your freedom starts, or where your freedom starts. This is the limit between us, and this is how we can deal with freedom and responsibility in the society. But when we distort this principle to this subjective, emotional, and again, as I said, with the values, preferences, tastes, then we will be lost, because there are no clear boundaries and no clear rules for us how to behave in the society. Thank you.
I think the only thing I want to say to this is that the current the international human rights framework, legally speaking, that is in force today, came about beginning in 1948, and it reflects a very serious effort to bring different cultural and political perspectives together in agreement. And I wonder if today the perspectives and approaches to politics and to freedom in the world are even more diverse than they were in 1948. And the UN human rights system today, it's a joke. You can quote me on that. The Human Rights Council is run by countries like Pakistan and China. The influence of China, which is just devastating as far as human rights goes. And Western countries are beginning to imitate China in the way they practice. China, the last time it was examined by in the Universal Periodic Review process was, all these states, they got up and applauded. They applauded China. And more states praised China than criticized China in this process. All these countries have China made them loans. In fact, I was there. They all use the same language, so the Chinese scripted out something to say and hand it out to all these countries so that they give these speeches. Okay, well, this is a disaster. When North Korea was examined by the Universal Periodic Review, they bragged. The North Korean diplomats bragged about they had signed the disability treaty. And so the impression that you get from this event was, well, yeah, they do burn people alive because they do burn political prisoners alive, which is true. But on the other hand, look, they have free education. So, they do respect human rights. And so, this is really extremely destructive of the idea of human rights. And so I think in our effort to approach human rights in a universal way, we are really wrecking the idea of the universality of human rights. And the idea of the universality of human rights, as you alluded to, Madam Minister, is really nurtured in a particular context, in a particular cultural context. And we had better take care of that rather than trying to convince countries like North Korea and China to accept the truth that we know about human rights.
So I will conclude with an outstanding French thinker, Marcel Gauchet, who says human rights don't make a public policy. That means that we, people of Europe, have, in my point of view, to decide where we want to go regarding who we are, rather than maybe trying to observe formal, abstract, disincarnated rights.
Thank you so much, and I thank you so much for inspiring all of us this wonderful afternoon. And ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists.